Good evening. My name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. Recording tonight on Monday, July 21st, 2025. This is story number 77 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Next month, on August 15th, it will be 80 years since the end of World War II. It was called VJ Day, Victory in Japan. Victory over Japan, I should say, on August 15th, 1945, and effectively the end of the whole war because a few months earlier, on May 8th, 1945, was VE Day, Victory in Europe. And 3 months ago, I did a story about that here on my YouTube channel as well. But the victory over Japan spelled the end of World War II, the greatest war in history. In the months leading up to August of 1945, Japanese airplane pilots who had many times bombed American ships, Navy ships, some of them became what was called the kamikaze pilots. They would actually fly their airplane into an American ship. So one pilot would be killed, but he takes the lives of several hundred Americans. And this was becoming a really terrible problem, of course, as the United States was taking back the islands that Japan had conquered, such as the Philippines, and was then planning to have an invasion on Japan itself. But in the meantime, in the American state of New Mexico, for the last year or so, there was the Manhattan Project, a very secret project going on where they developed the atomic bomb. And so on August 6, 1945, the first of 2 atomic bombs was dropped on Japan, the city of Hiroshima. And somewhere around 80,000 people died that day. And later on, over time, many people who suffered from radiation, the estimate eventually was about 140,000 people who died eventually altogether. And then the Japanese still did not surrender. Perhaps they were so stunned by this new weapon, and maybe they thought the United States had just one atomic bomb. But actually, 3 days later, the United States dropped the second one on the city of Nagasaki. And again, many thousands of people were killed. A terrible bomb, that indeed, but the reality is that it actually saved lives because had the United States had to invade Japan, it probably would have taken at least a year, if not 2 to 3 years. It would take a lot longer for that to completely be successful, to actually invade Japan with thousands of soldiers. So finally, after the second atomic bomb was dropped, and also the threat that Tokyo would be next, finally the high-ranking Japanese officials agreed to surrender. And so, effectively, the fighting stopped on August 14th, 1945, and the next day, August 15th, was celebrated as VJ Day. Especially in New York City, there were several million people came out to great celebration, and famously at Times Square, one of the photograph you see behind me of the sailor who kissed the young lady, that was taken there. And as many years people wondered, did they really know each other before that? But I found out they did an investigation on TV a few years ago. They really did not know each other before that. It was spontaneous. But there was just great celebration in the United States especially, that the whole war had ended. And VE Day celebration a few months before was actually pretty big in Europe because that was the defeat of Germany, and especially in a city like London and Paris, they were very happy about that as they were affected much more by the war against Germany. But the United States, of course, having been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, and a number of events that occurred afterwards, such as the terrible Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino allies who were prisoners of the Japanese were forced to march many miles with very few rest stops, and some of them were killed along the way. And the other atrocities committed by the Japanese in China, where they killed so many people, and also Korea. Finally, then, this war ended in August 1945, in great celebrations. The official surrender ceremony was a few weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, on the U.S. battleship Missouri, which was in Tokyo Bay, and the great General Douglas MacArthur presided at that ceremony, where members of all the Allied nations signed a document, including the Soviet Union and Great Britain and many other countries. And the official representative for the United States, even though MacArthur was the highest ranking general, and he was called Supreme Allied Commander for all the Far East Allies, he did not sign it, however. When it came time for the United States to sign, he called forward General Wainwright, a 3-star general who had been a prisoner of the Japanese for about 3 years. And he had to use a cane at that point. He had been injured, so he came forward and officially signed the document. And the Japanese officials later admitted they were more upset about that than if MacArthur had signed himself, because Wainwright had been a prisoner of the Japanese. But in any event, in the official end of the whole war, September 2nd, 1945, the greatest war in history that lasted 6 years and 1 day. September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, and then the official surrender by the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945. The greatest war in history had ended. My parents were the World War II generation, and I learned a lot about that great war in history. And I'd like to mention too that my mom, she lived in Europe shortly after World War II ended. She lived in Holland for 2 years, and then in London 2 years, working at the American embassies as Europe was rebuilding. A very interesting time for a young person to go to Europe and live there from 1947 to 1951, that 4-year period. And her big boss, actually, the Secretary of State then, was the great former General George Marshall, who during World War II was the Army Chief of Staff and became a 5-star general, like MacArthur and Eisenhower also became 5-star generals in the final year of World War II. But by the Truman administration, then Marshall was Secretary of State. And in 1953, George Marshall won the Nobel Peace Prize for his Marshall Plan, the great rebuilding of Europe. And I'm proud that my mom was an employee of the U.S. State Department during much of that time. In closing, I would just like to mention that we're recording on July 21st, and it was 38 years ago today that my mom died on July 21st, 1987. Her full name was Mary Carolyn Robinson Easter. She was born Mary Carolyn Robinson, and then when she married my father in January 1952, of course, her last name became Easter. Also, a local radio talk show host and a man who worked on WBAL for many years, Alan Walden, he once did a commentary about the World War II generation, and also the famous NBC newsman Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. But Alan Walden, in one of his commentaries on the radio back in the 1980s, mentioned how that generation sacrificed so much. These people grew up during the Great Depression, when things were tough also, and then the war came, how they just sacrificed so much, but most of those people went around their duties and did not complain. And he finished his broadcast that day by saying, the World War II generation, all they did was everything. And I'm proud to be the son of my parents who were the World War II generation. This is Phil Easter, the amazing memory man. As the great CBS television newsman Edward R. Murrow said, when he finished his broadcast. Good night and good luck.